First of all, I want to welcome everyone today. My name is Mike Ludwig. I'm the planning administrator for the city of Des Moines. The 18 years this July I've been with the city. It's gone very fast. There's been a lot of great things that happened in Des Moines, and I want to thank you for what you all have done to help make that happen in Des Moines. Today, very quickly, I want to just recognize we do have council members here today. We did post, there will be potentially more than 4 council members here today, so we did post that there will be more than 4 or more than 3 at this meeting. But it's not a public hearing, so the council's not asked to comment or to respond to questions today, because that's really the part of the public hearing process when we get to that. So they're here to listen today to the discussion and presentation, and then your comments and questions, and we'll do our best to answer those. I just want to make it very clear, today's meeting, as well as any of the meetings that are on the schedule, are not the only meetings available on this topic. I want to assure you that staff's committed to trying to answer as many questions as possible about this, whether it's today or through the meetings that were shown as upcoming tentative meetings on the PlanDSM webpage, or that's individual meetings that you'd like to have with staff to sit down and talk about the code and its impacts. So we are committed to doing that, and I just want to make sure that everybody knows that. So real quickly, we have Councilmember Gatto, Councilmember Westergaard in the back, Councilmember Bozen, and I think I saw Councilmember Rosenbaum. We have City Manager Sanders is in the back as well, and Community Development Director Chris Johansson is here, and then we also have some planning staff that are here from the Planning Urban Design Division. Eric's here, Bert and Jason are in the back as well, and I'm sorry, Bert's up here, and then Glenna Frank, the attorney that's assigned to the Planning and Zoning Commission and Board of Adjustment, is here as well. So we have staff here to try and answer questions. If we want to break down into smaller groups at some point and try and answer more questions, feel free to find a staff person. They've all been involved in preparing this revised draft, and so I think they're pretty well versed on what's in it, but we'll try and keep as many questions as we can in a group setting. So real quick, there's water and cookies on the table over there. There were sign-in sheets by the door. If you did not have a chance to sign in on your way in, please do so on the way out. When you did that at the last meeting we had, I used that for the invitation list for this, so please make sure you're signing in. If you need restrooms, they're straight down this main hallway here, left side, and water fountain out there as well. So anyway, looks like it's blue sky, so we don't have to worry about any storm notices for you. Real quick, I just wanted to go through a brief overview of kind of how to use the code very quickly. And then I want to focus on some major changes that exist in this draft versus the last draft we had a meeting about, and then open it up to questions. So I'm going to be very quick on the presentation side, leave the majority of the time for questions. So just how we got here, as you recall, in 2016, we adopted PlanDSM as our newest comprehensive plan for the city. The council also around that same time adopted their Guide DSM, which was their strategic plan. So if you think about it hierarchical, the citizens worked on PlanDSM. We had a lot of public outreach on that. The council took those goals, adopted them, and said, okay, how do we implement those goals? How are we going to budget for those goals that are in that plan? And so the Guide DSM was the council's effort to say, these are the priorities, the first priorities that come out of that plan, and what we're going to fund immediately to implement. So some of the things that were immediately funded by the Guide DSM were continuation of this PlanDSM effort to develop a zoning code. Move DSM was the city's transportation plan. That just got completed and got adopted in the last year by the council. We have nodes and neighborhood plans, so you've probably read some of our work on the neighborhood planning side of things, our efforts there. Live DSM was the city's Parks and Rec master plan update that just got adopted. And then obviously the CIP and the operating budgets the council adopt. So all those documents are implementation of PlanDSM and Guide DSM. So real quick on the zoning code, just how it's organized. The zoning chapter is chapter 134 in this new ordinance that's being proposed. Design and planning is in chapter 135. It's a very specific separation of those two chapters for various reasons. in the zoning chapter today, in the draft, the main things that are left in zoning are basically wireless telecommunications, the districts, establishment of districts on a zoning map, the sign regulations are in the zoning code still, and things like variances for either signage or variances for uses. Uses are defined in zoning chapter. That's really it. Everything else that has typically been zoning, setbacks, rear yard, front yard, side yard, those types of things have been moved into a planning and design chapter and are no longer proposed as zoning under our city code. They're proposed as a planning and design chapter, and as such, those regulations become either administered by staff administratively or the Plan and Zoning Commission through review. So there would no longer, under this code, be the need to go to the Zoning Board of Adjustment for a setback relief. That could either be granted administratively by staff or by the Plan and Zoning Commission. And then ultimately, if you disagree with either of those decision makers, it's ultimately appealable to City Council. Very fundamentally different than today. If you appeal a setback today and don't like the decision you get from the Board of Adjustment, you have to go to district court. And general rulings in the district court are, as long as there was a fair hearing, they generally side with the city or the Board of Adjustment to make their decisions after a public hearing. So it's fairly costly currently to go to district court to challenge those issues, and we feel it's a better setup. It's also timely to go through Board of Adjustment and all that. We believe it's a better setup in this code to have those types of things either administratively modified by staff or by the Plan and Zoning Commission, and then ultimately have purview by council if needed. So that's structurally how the code is set up. How to use the code. The last meeting, we've had a 10-step guide that's been out there for quite some time on how to use this code. And I honestly believe that's the easiest way to get through this code and understand what's in it. It doesn't necessarily get everything in the 10 steps, but at least takes you through a majority of what you would need to know to use the code. And what I've found is, if you try, I've heard people say, well, you try and read this code from front to back, it doesn't make sense. Try reading our existing code front to back. It doesn't make sense either. And you'll miss out on the site plan regulations that are in Chapter 82, totally different section of the code. So by putting these code sections next to each other in our city code and this 10-step guide, I think you can easily work your way through our code. It always starts with the zoning map. The last time we met, we had on our website some PDFs that were in 6 sections of the city showing the zoning map. It was kind of hard to zoom in and find a specific property on a map. In the time since then, we've brought the mapping function in-house from our consultants' work, and our GIS division created an app on our PlanDSM website. You can click on the zoning map, and it has just like the Find My House function on the city's current website. You can type in an address, and it'll take you to that area on the map, and you can get information. You can toggle between the existing zoning map or the proposed zoning map, so you know what your zoning is today and what your zoning would be under this new code if adopted. I think one of the key things we've heard about it is, how do you print it? And so just really quickly, when you're in this, I think the best way to print, there's not a print button on it, and the reason is, when you go to the mobile app, all the buttons are about to cover up the map when you get to them. So if we add any more buttons on that, the mobile app you won't be able to access it from your phones and actually be able to see the maps very well. So what I would recommend doing is, at your desk, use a roller on your mouse, and you can zoom the extent or spread out the extent. You can get the whole city on there, and you can toggle, and it'll change the map and show either the existing map or the new map on there. Whatever you want to print, zoom out to whatever extent you want, and just do a control print screen, and then basically open up a Word document and paste that into it. You can change the extents of the print screen and the page size and whatever else, and you can print maps that way. It's the best way I can give to you for getting those maps. Those will change as we're going through these hearing processes, so by printing a whole bunch of copies of that, it's going to be potentially out of date fairly quickly. So we are trying to save on not printing a bunch of copies of proposed and existing zoning maps. Fairly easy to use, and I think the searchable by address function is very helpful on it. Hope it's an improvement. Zoning districts in the code. Once you know what your zoning district is on the map, step 2 is you go and read about the zoning district. This is just a listing of the commercial and industrial zoning districts, basically mixed use districts in this code and industrial. And then more neighborhood or residential districts. And then also our ag district, flood district, what we're calling a P1 district, which is now our parks and recreation zoning, and P2, which would be a public, semi-public open space zoning district. So anyway, those are all of the districts. There's a description of each of those districts in the code. And again, once you know what your zoning is on the map, you just go to that applicable zoning district and read about it. You know your zoning district, you know what its intent is. You want to find out what uses are allowed. Everything in this code is in a table format as far as uses, so the districts are all across the top of the table. Uses are down the bottom. Right now, if you flip through our code, you'll go to C2 district and it'll say see also, after it lists 20 uses, it'll say see also R4. And you'll flip to R4 and read through a list. It'll say see also R3. And you have to just repeatedly flip back through the code. Not the easiest to use. By going through the charts, you can quickly see whether a use is allowed in your district. If not, what district you need to have that use allowed. So you can quickly, in one, it's basically 4 pages on the use table, you can quickly find out what district you need if you don't have it currently and whether your use is permitted. The next step after you know your use is permitted or what district you want to be applying for, you go to the building type section of the code. And this is in chapter 135. There are different building types that are allowed in each district. And again, it's in a table format, so you know what district you're in. You go to this and find out what building types are required in that zoning district. Again, zoning districts across the top, building types down the left-hand column of those tables. In the building type tables, there are some symbols in there that talk about when retail or occupied space is required on a street. It references a primary frontage or a primary map. On our PlanDSM website, we have the primary streets map draft available. You can zoom in to an area larger as a city. There's also an inset on in that map of just downtown, so you can see what streets are there. We obviously know that we have way more primary streets and square footage, building lineal feet frontage than there is demand for retail. So there is flexibility in this code proposed for not necessarily requiring the retail to go in day one, but is it something that we expanded the uses that could occupy first floors of those mixed use buildings, and we expanded flexibility on when that can be waived in this draft. And this was just zoomed in on that smaller map or area map on the larger map. Again, once you know what building type you're looking for, they're explained later in the chapters in chapter 135. And biggest thing is there's a 4-page spread for each building type. This is where you find out height limits, placement of the building on the site. What you typically would have thought of were setbacks in the old zoning code. Now design function under this code gives you all the information about that, those types of building requirements. At the very back of those documents, the last pages, there are some additional design requirements in the back of each building type. This is where, if you've had a chance to look at the code, you'll find the provision, which I've had numerous questions about already, about the house types A, B, C, and D, which are single-family detached housing types, having a minimum square footage requirement, a garage requirement, and a basement requirement. You'll find that in the building type chart for each applicable building type. So if anybody's wondering where that was or where that came from or where it exists in the code, that's where it is in this code. And we can certainly discuss those requirements. So you know what building, you know what your setbacks are and all that. Then you go to the design section, which talks about building materials and that. Just for example, I'll cover in a minute, we have about major changes to the code. There was a lot of concern on single-family homes last time about that vinyl wasn't a allowed exterior material. It is allowed under this draft. So that was a revision we made for single-family detached. But the design requirements talk about windows and building materials and general standards. After that, our new parking section has been rewritten. Again, this is fairly similar to before. On the vehicle parking, it represents probably about a 30% reduction in required parking from what our current code requires, just overall. Not every use, but overall it's about a 30% reduction. And what we've tried to say is we're moving this parking code more towards being compatible with what our existing neighborhood pedestrian commercial zoning district allows, which is it allows a 40% reduction through site plan review today without going to the Board of Adjustment. So we are trying to reduce the required parking on site. Just it's environmental issue too, sustainability issue.
Is that because of parking transportation needs are changing?
Yeah.
Shared vehicles?
Yeah, I think it's both transportation needs are changing and also a stormwater management, trying to address stormwater management and runoff and treating the water before it leaves the site. That the landscape standards and the parking standards are both trying to do that. So it's a combination. The one major change, which I'll get to in a second, but I wanted to point it out on the parking side, bike parking is in this code. Right now it's typically only if there's development incentives associated, TIF associated with it. We use that as a tax abatement. One of the options you can use as a developer. The major change in this draft though is previous draft had two types of bike parking required. There was a type A, which was a interior bike parking within the building somewhere, long-term parking, and then there were type B, which was the outside bike racks. The interior parking has been eliminated from this draft, and that was one of your comments, Jimmy. Obviously, there were concerns about it. It still is optional if you want to do it, but we're going to let the market decide whether or not multifamily will do that. So we did make a fairly significant change to the code in that respect to address your concerns. Landscape, streetscape. This is an enhancement over our existing landscape standards in the code. In general, we're trying to address the stormwater runoff. The more water we can absorb on the site and control it from leaving the site through adding additional green space and grass and trees will help reduce our long-term cost to treat that water when it goes into the river. And it obviously reduces the runoff that we're going to send down the river from us, just as we're concerned about what's coming from above stream to us. So we are trying to be good stewards in that perspective. Signage, I don't know if any of you deal with our sign code much. I generally leave it up to our building permit staff because it's not easy to find anything in the sign code currently. Everything's been revamped into tables in this code. Again, districts across the top, sign types down the side of the charts, and I think there's better illustrations of those sign regulations and how they apply. We also have been very focused on making sure that we're regulating sign types and not content in this code as required, and we think we've achieved that in this draft. Once you know all kind of the development requirements, again, you find a requirement that you're not sure that you're meeting or you know you're not meeting, there's review procedures and processes in the Chapter 135 to those design regulations. Staff has a lot greater latitude under this code to administratively grant relief to design standards than exist under our current code. And again, the relief is either through staff or planning commission versus going to the Board of Adjustment under this code. So there's individual things listed under the procedure section of what staff can do, as well as under specific criteria in the code. When you're reading through it, they're also listed in there whether staff has the authority to grant relief. So again, our goal was, the example I'll give was we had a multifamily project downtown that came in. There's conflict in our existing code. The underlying zoning says put the building back 25 feet from the property line. We have an overlay district that says put it out at the property line. They had to go to the Board of Adjustment, get relief to be able to put the building out at the street where we wanted them to put it. We supported their app, but it still took them 30 days to go through the Board of Adjustment to get that. Then, because it was a multifamily project, they had to go to the Planning Commission for a site plan review. So our staff wrote a second report for just the site plan part of it. It ended up, that project was in a use that we wanted, in a location we wanted it. The building was sited where we wanted it. The building was designed like we wanted it, and it still was in process over 90 days with the city to get that project approved today under the current code. Under the proposed code, we could have eliminated going to the Board of Adjustment for that because the conflicts are eliminated under this code. There's no longer mandatory review of multifamily site plans by Planning Commission under this code. They can be reviewed administratively by staff. And so we think that's one example of how this code is creating a fast pass, if you want to call it. We're being very prescriptive on what the design requirements are. If you're willing to follow them, there is a shorter process that you can go through. If you don't want to meet those guidelines, there's still a process available. It will take similar to the timeline that we have today, but you can go to the Planning Commission and you can go to council and seek variation or total variation from the standards that are in the code. The other procedures are then back in the zoning chapter. So if you need a variance to a sign requirement, there still are exceptions and variances from the Board of Adjustment for signs. Similarly, if you're a wireless telecommunications company putting in a thing and you need a variance, there's provisions for that. If you have a use that is in the code that isn't allowed on a property, use variances are still granted by the Board of Adjustment. But design alone is not going to create a nonconformity under this code. The only nonconformity that we care about as a staff perspective is use in this code. And so, again, I know there were concerns last time that all these design regulations, if you didn't have the right building materials, your property was going to be non-conforming under this code. That is not the case. We've separated that, and design does not determine non-conformity in this status. So, key changes. Nomenclature in this code. Previously, we referred to them as type 1 exceptions. They're now called design alternatives in the code. So there's type 1 and type 2 design alternatives in Chapter 135 to the design requirements. On the non-conforming design was in the code before. It's now called pre-existing, and it's pre-existing design. And again, it is separated out from the use. The procedures have been separated out, so there's no confusion. There's no reference in 135 to send you back to a procedure in 134 any longer in this code. They have their own separate procedures. The minimum square footages for single-family detached structures was added to this. And again, those are ranch, 1,400 square feet, story and a half, 1,600 square feet, two-story, 1,800 square feet. If you've not had a chance, when I said in those housing types tables, these requirements are listed. There's also a reference in that section already that takes you back to the procedures. And I just want to be very clear, under this code, the square footages for single-family detached houses are eligible to up to a 30% exception, design exception from staff without going to Planning Commission. It's called a design alternative, not a design exception. But at 30%, if the full 30% was granted, that would take a 1,400 square foot ranch down to 980 square feet is the minimum. So there are administrative remedies to the square footages in this code if you haven't had a chance to read that far into it. We heard a lot about the administrative relief in the code. Previously, the staff maximum to a numerical requirement was a 15% variation. That is doubled in this code to 30%. So if you think about today, right now, we have the ability to grant an administrative exception under our existing code, that's 15% of a requirement for a setback, but we also require you to go out and get signatures of every adjoining property owner to get that relief. And it's time consuming to do that. Everybody chooses to go to the Board of Adjustment instead. The Board of Adjustment can grant up to 50% relief of a code as an exception and over 50% as a variance. What we've tried to do is increase what can be approved by staff administratively, and that's now a 30%. So we're beyond halfway to what you can get through the Board of Adjustment right now fairly easily, but still have to go through a 30-day process to get. The 1.5 story requirement, there was a lot of questions last time about 1.5 story minimum requirement for detached single-family residential. That requirement was reduced to 1 story in every district, I believe, except for the N4 district, which is predominantly Beaverdale, where the character of that neighborhood is 1.5 story homes. But everywhere else, greenfield development is mostly zoned N2 on this map. It has a 1 story minimum in the code for that. The house type A in the N2 district was revised. I know there was a concern that with the previous draft that it appeared it didn't allow 3-car garages, didn't allow kind of the standard home that had been built in a lot of subdivisions. We increased the amount of percentage of the front of the house that can be a garage in this code from 50 to 65% in that N2 district for house type A, which is your typical single-family house that's been built on greenfield development in Des Moines and in our suburbs. And so we think that increased percentage in the table, as well as what will soon to be corrected, which is allowing the garage to project. Right now it says recessed. It was supposed to say project. Our proposal is, by right, let the garage project 8 feet in front of the home, the main portion of the home. That was derived at, it's basically 1/3 of the standard depth of the garage. Previously, the code said it had to be flush or recessed from the front of the house, so we did make a change in the code to that respect, and there still is the opportunity to seek relief to that requirement. We have a requirement for full basements on single-family homes. Just so you understand where that came from in this, our hope is we've been looking at how can over time there be an economical increase in potential valuation of properties over time. Obviously, finishing off extra space or a basement is one of the ways that we think that can happen long term. It doesn't have to be finished initially. Our general thought was that the basement requirement was, yes, it's an increased cost, but it was an incremental cost. You're already going down 48 inches to frost depth with a footing for a slab construction home. Additional excavation, additional foundation wall, and floor joists to span the foundation, or the increased costs from that side of it. We think overall the ability for that space to be converted over time into additional living space gives us the opportunity to capture some additional growth in tax base long term. Right now, the code proposes that we as staff can waive that requirement if it's a water table issue, or if you can't provide sewer to that lowest floor elevation of the basement. We could waive that administratively. However, if you wanted to just not build a basement or reduce the size from currently the full basement, the full footprint, you'd have to go to the Planning Commission under this draft. Those are obviously up for discussion under this process. We do have proposed a minimum 12 by 24 garage on single family and 2-family residential dwellings. That basement requirement is also for 2-family. This garage requirement, got a post-World War Des Moines, Merle Hay neighborhood, 10 by 20, 12 by 20 is a fairly typical garage that was built post-World War II construction. And what we found is we're spending exorbitant amounts of money on property cleanup, abatement of nuisances, junk and debris. And it's not necessarily that the junk and debris is going away in this instance. It might be going inside, but from a physical appearance of the neighborhood, it makes a huge difference when that is not out in the yard and they don't have adequate storage on their property. So we are trying to address this. This is not purely about parking cars and hiding cars. It's about providing adequate storage on properties. And the other thing is, we found that the long-term, the properties that don't have a garage with them are not appreciating at the same rate as the homes that do in Des Moines. And again, from a tax-based standpoint in Des Moines, we're trying to make sure that at least the valuations are appreciating similar to our suburban peers when it comes to garages. The other part of it is that as a homeowner from an affordable housing standpoint, one of the things of an affordable housing standpoint is you're gaining, hopefully, equity in your home. If your home isn't appreciating at the same rate, they're not getting the same benefit of that as well. So yes, there's an increased cost, but on the other side, there's the opportunity to appreciate the same rate as other properties that have those amenities. Garage door requirements, as I said, the code currently says recessed. It's a typo, it's an error in the code. It was intended to say that they can project in front of the home. We added flexibility for roof types and horizontal windows. I know Scott McMurray, if you're here, you'd raised a question about this during your review. We now have greater, it's now not just a vertical window orientation that's called out for in the code. It does allow horizontal to address more prairie style architecture. I told you about the bike parking. We created greater flexibility in the solar regulations that are in the code for solar panels, building and freestanding. The materials table was revised to allow vinyl specifically for detached single-family residential. The occupied space requirement in commercial buildings is eligible for a type 2 design alternative through Planning Commission under this draft. We debated type 1 or type 2. Directive so far has been to leave it as a type 2. And then the wireless telecommunications regs were added. Cemeteries are addressed in this code. Home occupations were revised per our council strategic planning session. We now have our short-term rental, which is, if you want to think Airbnb, other platforms are addressed by this code. We updated use tables. Again, we eliminated that overlap in processes between 134 and 135. And then electronic billboards were actually revised. We previously had proposed a prohibition on billboards. This code actually does allow a limited amount of digital billboards on major commercial corridors, and those corridors are defined in the code. This is a map of those corridors. So any new conversion, any new electronic billboard, or any conversion of a static display to a digital billboard is only allowed on those red corridors on this map. Schedule is on our PlanDSM website. Again, this was the minimum number of meetings that were scheduled. Obviously, we have some upcoming workshops of our Planning Commission to get them familiar with this. Our steering committee, council has to learn. We're talking 5 to 6 months minimum before this code could even take effect. So there's plenty of opportunity for input and comment, and I'm welcome to meet, like I said, whether it's today, at one of these meetings that are scheduled, or an individual meeting. I'd be happy to sit down and go over your concerns with the proposed draft. So